Retirement is a very unnatural state.
What do you think some of the big challenges that are related to this transition from saving to spending?
We are proud of the fact that we're savers. Sometimes people who have saved enough money are not necessarily all that happy because...
Are there any other risks that you think people need to plan for in retirement?
One of the biggest mistakes I see people making is...
Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Retirement Plan Simplified. I am Joe Curry, along with my co-host, as always, Lindsay Wilson. Hi, Lindsay. How are you?
I'm great, Joe. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. So for today's show, we had Michael Finke on. He is a retirement researcher. I'll let you do the bio, Lindsay, but basically we were all over the place in our topic today. A lot of this was related to our past episode with Benjamin Brandt. We talked about some of the non-financial planning aspects of retirement planning, finding more happiness and fulfillment in retirement, some of the things that actually make people happy. And we talked about where money fits into all that as well. And then we talked about other things that we just need to be cognizant of as we approach and we get into retirement and later in retirement planning that sometimes is overlooked that really should be part of any financial plan. So hit on a lot of topics, not any one specific, but anyway, I think our listeners will enjoy this one.
Yeah. And Michael Finke is a PhD in CFP. He's a professor of wealth management and Frank M. Engel Distinguished Chair in Economic Security at the American College of Financial Services. He received a doctorate in consumer economics from Ohio State University in 1998 and in finance from the University of Missouri in 2011. He leads the O. Alfred Granum Center for Financial Security at the American College and is a research fellow at the Retirement Income Institute and a member of the Defined Contribution Institutional Investment Association Academic Advisory Council. And he also serves on the board of the Puerto Rico Pension Reserve Trust. He is a nationally known researcher in the areas of retirement income planning, retirement spending, life satisfaction, and cognitive aging. He is a frequent speaker at financial planning conferences and was named one of the 25 most influential people in the field of investment advising in 2020 and 2021 by Investment Advisor magazine.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of credentials there, a lot of credibility. So anyway, I hope everybody enjoys this episode with Michael Finke. Thanks, Lindsay. Okay, Michael, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Joe?
I'm good, thanks. I'm excited to have you on the show. I see your content pop up a lot on thekitsis.com, which is one of my favorite sites. And I just finished doing another podcast interview on a similar topic. So I'm really excited to kind of your take on some of this stuff, but just we'll maybe talk a little bit about money things, but also talking about non-financial related aspects of retirement. So with
Great.
all of that, I'm going to jump right in and ask, so what are your thoughts on how retirees can shift their mindset to embrace enjoyment and fulfillment in retirement?
Whew, that's a big question. So I do a lot of research on life satisfaction in retirement. I look at this big data set called the Elton Retirement Study. It's 20,000 retirees. Started in 1994, and it follows them over time. And it's really changed the way that I think about planning for retirement, because I think for a lot of us, we feel that retirement planning is all about having enough. It's about saving. It's about investing properly. It's about getting to the point where we don't have to worry about the money aspect. But I think that leaves a lot of room for planning other aspects of retirement that oftentimes people don't give enough thought to. And that is how we're going to spend our time after we retire. You know, retirement in some ways is a very unnatural state. We're very used to going to work and all the challenges and social interactions that we get from the work environment. When we step away from it, life's different. And I think some people can handle that life better than others. And if you haven't given much thought to it, then it makes sense to devote as much time to planning out what you're going to do with your time as it does to planning out whether or not you've saved enough money and what you're going to do with that money after you retire. When we look at the data, what we see is that sometimes people who have saved enough money are not necessarily all that happy because they're not making some of the right decisions.
Yeah, it's interesting. We see with clients, a lot of clients, they can just fall into a retirement routine and they say they're busier than ever and they're having fun and they're seeing their grandkids and they got all their different activities lined up. But then we also see other clients who, they worked hard their whole life and then they really struggle to find their way. And so the money's not an issue at all, but they don't really know where they fit in. They've kind of lost their identity a little bit, and it creates other challenges. And the whole idea of what most people are thinking when they get to retirement is they're excited about not having to work, but often, like you said, not giving enough thought or planning to the non-financial side. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of like social connections and physical health, different things like that in retirement.
Yeah, so we find that the predictors of life satisfaction really fall into three categories. One is money, that people who have more money are happier. Now, there tends to be a ceiling of about $4.5 million where, beyond that, people are not really any happier. In fact, maybe even a little less happy. And it's mainly because they have enough money and they have a burden of actually having to manage too much money. So at some point, it's kind of too much. We also look at the form of wealth that people have. Do they have it in investments, or do they have it in the form of something that looks more like a pension where you get a monthly income? And what we find is that people who have a monthly income, they tend to spend more. So they tend to be happier than the people who just have an equivalent amount of wealth in investments. And we can maybe talk a little bit about why that is. Now, and the other two categories are relationships and relationship quality. And in particular, what we see is that the quality of the relationship that you have with your spouse becomes even more important after retirement. For those people who have a partner, that relationship, if it's positive, retirement's a lot better. If it's negative, then retirement is actually worse than it is if you're single. So, it's not the case that simply being married is making you happier. It's having a happy marriage that's making you better off. And also the relationships that you have with your friends have a big impact on life satisfaction. And in many cases, the friendships that we make during our working years, we carry into retirement. And it's important to view those friendships as an investment because it takes a certain amount of time and effort and sometimes money to be able to build the quality of those relationships. And then we can kind of draw from that investment after we retire. The third category is health. And this should be obvious, but health is a strong predictor. I mean, health essentially is a input into all of the activities that we can do in retirement. If we don't have health, then we're limited. I mean, what's the use of money? And the example that I've thought about, and this is relevant to my own retirement because going hiking is one of the things I want to do in my own retirement. You can have the money to fly to Switzerland and stay in a chalet and have everything you need to be able to go hiking. But if you don't have a VO2 max or an ability to process oxygen of about 30 or above, then you can't hike in the mountains in altitude. And that requires an investment as well. So that means that as part of thinking about retirement, you have to think about what activities you want to do. And if the activities require not just money, but also physical health, then you have to be able to maintain those to be able to enjoy it. So it's really, both health and relationships and money, all three are investments. And the way that I define investments are anything that requires a sacrifice today in order to live better in the future. An investment in health, investment in relationships, that requires a deliberate sacrifice that we can then draw from after we retire.
I think this is a good way of looking at it. And this might be self-explanatory just based on all the information you've given. But if you had to give some specific actions that, say, pre-retirees could be taking to think of how they invest in these different areas, do you have any thoughts on that, any strategies or specific action items?
To me, the best way to think about it is in terms of money. We want to be able to have a certain lifestyle without having to worry about it. I've estimated that about 65% of a retiree's expenses are fixed. So let's find a way to make sure that no matter what happens, I can always cover my fixed expenses. And then the question becomes, how flexible do I want to be with the rest of my budget? That's going to determine in some senses how much risk I'm willing to take with my retirement investments. But also, let's be realistic about the fact that we don't live forever. And this is, I think, one of the biggest barriers to planning for retirement is, let's say you're a healthy 65-year-old woman. You started out life with maybe 9 rows of 10 dots. But that's your average expected longevity is 9 rows of 10 dots. By the time you get to 65, you've got 2 rows of 10 dots and 1 row of five dots left in terms of your average expected longevity. You have a certain amount of money, and how do you spread it across that expected longevity? Now, there's always a possibility that you could live longer, which means that you're probably going to be a little bit more conservative. But I think a lot of people don't really think about the idea that when they've saved all this money, they had to save it for some sort of a purpose. And the purpose is either a lifestyle or it's to pass the money on after you're gone. And how do you want to prioritize that? I feel like, I've done interviews with the retirees where they will be proud of the fact that they're not spending money in retirement. They're actually accumulating more wealth. And I will ask them, well, you must really want to pass that money on to your kids. And very often they say, well, no, that's not why I'm not spending the money. But the reality is that there's only 2 places the money can go, and you can give it away while you're alive. And, it might be more fun to give money, as my grandmother used to say, with a warm hand instead of a cold hand. When your kids are younger, or your grandkids are better able to enjoy the money, and you're able to see them enjoy the money. I think this is one of the things that I see about people who have, over the course of their lifetime, always spent less than their income. When they get to retirement, oftentimes they have a very difficult time actually spending more than their income and seeing that wealth go down. But that's, I think, a mental barrier that a lot of us have to overcome, and myself included.
What do you think some of these big challenges are that are related to this transition from saving to spending? Like, what is there something there that you can, I guess, maybe dive into on, like, why is it such a tough transition?
I think that a lot of us, we are proud of the fact that we're savers and that we have accumulated a nest egg. In fact, our own self-identity is associated with the size of that nest egg in many cases. I've done research on people that I call ants. The ants always spend less than their income. They always save money for the future. By the time they get to retirement, what I find is that the ants have a difficult time, especially the wealthier ants spend far less than you would have expected them to spend by the time they get to retirement. I also see grasshoppers, and grasshoppers are people who tend to spend money when they get it. And for grasshoppers, they tend not to have any trouble spending the money in retirement. For them, it's really about making sure that they don't run out. And then we look at things like, when an ant gets an inheritance from their parents, let's say their parents pass away in their 90s, they get the inheritance when they're in their late 60s. How much of that do they actually spend? And we find that they spend about an extra $5 for every $1,000 that they receive. So for each year they spend an extra $5, which means that the money's going to last with interest, a few hundred years. A grasshopper will spend an extra $267 for every $1,000 that they get in an inheritance, which means it's going to be gone in less than 4 years. And oftentimes when people are doing estate planning, they have kids who are ants and some kids who are grasshoppers. And if you have a kid who's grasshopper, they're going to actually enjoy the money that you didn't spend. But they're not going to be passing it on to the next generation. So, I think part of the thought about retirement planning is also planning for what's going to happen to your wealth after you're gone, and giving some thought to what it is that you want to accomplish through an estate plan. Because the consequence of not spending enough, if you're an ant and you can't bring yourself to actually spend the money while you're alive, the consequence is that it's going to go to someone else. And it may be that your kids are not universally ants.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny just listening to you talk about all that. Is I can see, like, I have these two kind of pictures of different types of clients in our practice. And it's usually what I find is, and you've kind of already alluded to this a bit, but it's the people who have accumulated a nice nest egg where they've achieved financial independence through saving. They're the ones that have a really hard time transitioning to that spending mindset. And then the people who come to us because they had an inheritance, or they sold a business, or they had a defined contribution pension, they're just moving all the money over now, but they've never really saved out of pocket. It's the exact opposite with them. It's trying to help make sure they don't spend it too quickly.
I feel it's like, it's your job to help the ants feel more comfortable spending more.
Yes.
And, I think a great way to do that is just to map out what their budget is going to look like and give them the permission to be able to spend a certain amount of money. Even if it means that you automatically withdraw the money and put it into their checking account every month and say, this is part of your lifestyle. If you see the money piling up, then, make sure you go out to dinner with friends or something, or go on vacation. Like you can spend this money. That the goal, and part of the goal-based process of retirement planning, which is something that I firmly believe in, is at the very outset deciding what are your values, what do you want to do with the money, and then how do you want to do it? How do you want to allocate it across your lifespan? Because one of the biggest mistakes I see people making is you don't have that long in retirement to really get the most out of the money that you've saved. And this is kind of a depressing aspect of retirement planning, but when you look at the data, you really see it. That I recently did a study where I looked at what I call fun spending. So this is going out on vacations or going out to dinner or going to shows. This is the kind of fun spending that really makes life worthwhile. And that spending tends to really decline in your 80s and 90s, to the point where people who are wealthy are not really spending any more than people who are maybe middle class, not quite as wealthy. That you tend to experience these cognitive and physical changes as you get older. And that should be part of your retirement plan. But what that also means is you cannot be afraid, if you have all these goals that you want to be able to accomplish, you can't be afraid to accomplish those relatively early on in retirement, even if it means taking some money off the table and devoting it to your enjoyment.
Yeah. So one of the questions I had for you was, what are some strategies we can use to address emotional barriers with spending in retirement? But before I have you answer that, because I think my next questions will probably lead into that, it's just kind of two parts. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on the research around retirement income planning, safe withdrawal rates, kind of the more traditional retirement spending strategies. Yeah. And then also talking about like goals-based retirement planning. So you kind of mentioned that. So maybe you could go a little more into goals-based, talking about it compared to traditional. And I feel like that might bring it back to how we get people to spend more money.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the traditional ways that we think about pulling money out of an investment portfolio. Now, because none of us know how long we're going to live, and we don't know what investment returns are going to be in the future, oftentimes, if we want to maintain exactly the same lifestyle every year, we have to be pretty conservative, because we could live a long time, or investment returns could be really low. Now, that's probably not the right way to approach it. The right way to approach it is to, first of all, create that foundation, that lifestyle foundation, using less risky types of investments to build yourself this lifestyle that no matter what happens in the market, you're always going to be able to maintain it. And then think about, all right, for the remainder of my lifestyle, how variable am I willing to be? And that's where we start thinking about, all right, instead of this 4% rule idea where, let's say I've saved $2 million, I can spend $80,000 the first year of retirement. Let's increase that to maybe $100,000 or maybe even a little bit more. But we have to acknowledge that if we get unlucky, if the market doesn't do as well as we'd hoped, then we probably have to cut back on that spending later on. And if you're willing to cut back, then the money can be preserved. You can avoid that possibility of running out of savings, but you have to be willing to be flexible. And that also means you have to be able to look at your lifestyle and say, all right, this is my flexible portion of my lifestyle. How much of this am I willing to cut back on? So if the market loses money, then maybe I'm not going to spend more next year. Maybe I'm going to cut my spending by a few $1,000s. But that's, you have to respond to what the market is giving you. But I don't agree with this idea that it's really good to be super conservative right from the outset in order to ensure that I can spend exactly the same amount of money every year, maybe adjusted by inflation, because people can be flexible. They can adjust their spending over time. And the data show that people actually do end up spending less in their late 70s and 80s simply because they're less active than they were back in their late 60s and early 70s. So I really want to be able to preserve people's abilities to spend more money when they're younger and can really enjoy the money. And I feel like we can find all sorts of ways to get worried about running out of money.
Yeah.
But part of the retirement planning, and especially this goal-based planning process, is to get people to feel comfortable actually spending. So we have to give them essentially the license to be able to spend the money they have, because you've preserved, say, a minimum lifestyle for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that, and maybe I'll ask you a little bit about like guaranteed income type products, but I think just from your research and things I've read, and just from anecdotal experience as well, I think we see that people who have like guaranteed income come in are more likely to spend more money, right? So how does that potentially factor into planning?
Yeah. So, economists tend to be very favorable to this idea of taking part of your savings and using it to essentially buy a pension like income. So, you go to an insurance company, you give them a lump sum of money, and you can take a certain amount of income for your lifetime. Why do economists like this so much? Well, because it means that you can essentially spend as if you're living to the average longevity. But if you live longer than that, you can continue spending the same amount. So you can spend more per dollar of savings compared to money that you would have invested in, say, bonds or some other type of low volatility type of investment. You can spend more dollars. That's rationally, you can spend more dollars because you're not exposed to this risk of potentially running out. Because the alternative is you've got to spread the money out, say, to the age of 100 to make sure that you don't run out, even if you live to the age of 100. So instead, you can spend as if you're going to live to the age of 90, and the insurance company takes all the risk if you live beyond the age of 90. You've essentially transferred longevity risk to an institution. Now, from my own research, what I find is that not only do you get that expected benefit of being able to spend more, people spend even more than we would have expected. So in other words, they tend to treat the income that they get every month from something like a pension differently than they treat the amount of, the equivalent amount they could have spent from investments. So it gives people the psychological ability, when the money goes into the checking account, they feel like they can spend it. If it's in an investment account, then they feel like they can't spend it. The alternative also is to create some sort of automatic withdrawal from your investment accounts into your checking account so that there's constantly this flow of money where you feel like it's okay to spend it. I mean, it's a psychological burden for many of us. We don't feel comfortable spending out of savings, but we're totally fine spending money out of our checking account.
Yeah.
Let's figure out a way to actually get people to feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's perfect. It's something we've switched to over the last couple of years is Wade Fowle, who you probably know, his retirement income style assessment or awareness, right? So helping people make sure that they have a plan in place that they're comfortable with,
right,
and then trying to automate the spending so that they're actually spending more money. And I think I mentioned in the podcast before, one of my favorite comments I've got from a client was, we had a do-it-yourself investor come in. He's an engineer, and she was a teacher. And anyway, but he was very in-depth with the investments and all the cash flow, all that kind of stuff. And anyway, they started working with us because he wanted to make sure there was a succession plan if something happened to him with their money. And anyway, when we got some feedback from them after working with them for a year, her first comment was, we're, so happy because now I know we can spend more money than I thought we could. So no longer is my spouse bugging me about spending too much on shopping or traveling or eating out or whatever it is. That was the big benefit they got because they were able to see how much they could actually be spending and just have it going directly to the accounts. So, and we've had a few scenarios like that. So anyway, it's always fun to see that kind of stuff. But I think a big part for a lot of people, when they just have a retirement projection and then they see markets doing different things, there's just a lot of uncertainty there, and just makes it harder to spend the money.
It does. I've had this experience actually of working. I had someone contact me once who was going through this process on her own. She actually worked in the arts, and she had a pension of $1,000 a month, and she had saved a certain amount of money for retirement, and she just felt like she couldn't spend more than $3,000 a month. That it would be somehow frivolous or wrong to spend more than that amount. So we actually broke it down to the different elements, and we said, all right, so you can buy yourself a lifetime income with this chunk of your savings that'll allow you to spend $3,500, and then you'll have this remaining chunk of your savings. You can pull 4% out of that. You can spend $5,500 a month. And I mean, she was almost in tears by the end of the conversation because she had uncertainty where she just didn't feel right spending more than that amount. And once you provide a certain amount of clarity, then all of a sudden you give them the freedom to be able to live better. And what does that mean? Well, that means that she can go visit her daughter more frequently, or she can go, on a travel with friends. And this lifestyle didn't seem possible to her until she'd had a conversation with someone. So I actually suggested that she go see a financial advisor, and the financial advisor put together a plan that actually allowed her to have a completely different type of lifestyle. And that's, how much fun is that? Like, that is what, I feel when I look at the data, I see all sorts of people who just are not spending the money, and they may all have their own reason for not spending the money, but feeling like it's okay, getting the advice of a professional who says, all right, you can spend this amount of money and you're going to be fine. Like, you're going to be able to meet all of your goals, and you're not going to run out of money. It's an eye opener, but it also helps people live better. Everybody should have that.
Yeah. It's, like we said earlier, sometimes you just need permission, really. Like, people just need permission that it's okay to spend, and they're going to be okay. We had another client had this money set aside in an account. It was from her first marriage. And she said she's keeping it. She can't touch that money because it's for her kids. So finally we said to her, if you don't need it, first of all, you don't need the money. That's fine if you don't want to spend it. Like, you have lots of other money and income to spend. But if you want your kids to get it, then is there any reason we're waiting for you to not be here to actually give them the money? And anyway, so we had some conversations around this. She ended up giving that inheritance to the kids while she's still alive. She came back crying to me about how happy she was, and the reaction she's got from the kids, and telling me how they're going to use the money. And I'm so thankful that she actually moved forward with that, because since in the last year or so, she's starting to struggle from dementia, and actually is going to maybe transition into the next part of the conversation. But anyway, that was just an example of where, like, sometimes they just need permission, and it's okay to spend the money now. So.
Right. And oftentimes it takes being confronted about what your goals are to recognize that, what I'm doing right now is probably not the best way to do it. But
yeah,
that's the advantage of having a conversation with someone else, someone who is outside of your own situation, who can kind of hold a mirror to you and ask you to explain what it is that you want to do with the money.
It's just another perspective, basically, right? Yeah. Sometimes even just having a conversation, you hear yourself talking out loud, and start thinking about what was the plan there. So, as I mentioned, kind of switching gears a little bit here, and on that topic, maybe we could talk a little bit about the impact of cognitive decline later in life. It's something that you've written about before.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that does get a bit sensitive, because a lot of people don't want to believe that they are going to experience these declines as they get older. None of us want to believe that. But the reality is that when you look at the data, by the time you reach age 85, you've got pretty much a 1 in 3 chance that you're experiencing some kind of dementia. And that enough dementia that you're not going to be able to make effective financial decisions on your own anymore. So it's, first of all, it doesn't matter how many crossword puzzles you do, you're still vulnerable. People think that it's just a matter of laziness that's going to make people vulnerable to experiencing cognitive decline. No, it's just natural age-related cognitive decline. And if we embrace that as simply part of the bargain of being a mortal human being, is that we're going to experience these declines, then let's make sure that as part of that planning process, we set ourselves up for a different type of lifestyle once we start hitting our mid-80s, transitioning to a less independent type of lifestyle, maybe moving away from your home to a different type of living environment, automating the financial part of your life, making sure that you have a professional that can help you out, even thinking about what to do if you start experiencing dementia. How do you want to transition financial decision making to someone else? Because very often it'll happen automatically that maybe a child is going to take over your financial decisions, but it may not be the person who you want to take over your financial decisions. So giving thought to how you want to transition to that stage where you are going to be less capable, to me, that's should be part of the retirement planning process.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. And are there any other risks that you think people need to plan for in retirement, whether they're well-known risks or just things that don't get a lot of attention?
Well, I mean, to me, the biggest risk is not getting the most out of that part of your life. Like, people tend to focus on the worst possible thing that could happen instead of focusing on habits. And habits will define the quality of your retirement. And if you've developed this habit of, sitting in front of the TV and getting angry at the world and not experiencing the same amount of social interactions that you did during your working life, then you are failing just as much as if you ran out of money. You're not getting the most out of that retirement experience that you could. So to me, habits are it when it comes to building a successful retirement. What is it that you want to accomplish in retirement? And then how can you develop the habits that will allow you to accomplish that objective? And if you're not developing or at least being conscious about those habits, then think about ways to break the current habit that you're in. Develop a greater amount of structure, give thoughts to, if you want to be more socially active, then how can you create an opportunity to get out of the house and be more socially active on a regular basis? If you want to be more physically active, how can you create some sort of a habit where you're going to maintain your physical activity? That will essentially define how successful that period of your life is going to be.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice. Are there any emerging trends you're seeing in retirement planning research?
Oh boy. So yeah, I just got back from an academic conference, so I can talk about it a little bit. One of the big unknowns right now is the amount of benefit that we're going to get for taking investment risk, and this is a big issue. Lots of really interesting conversations about where we are right now, that a lot more individuals are invested in risky assets, and risky assets are quite valuable, which means the prices are very high right now. So there's a lot of conversation about what are the implications of maybe getting lower expected returns in the future than we have experienced in the more recent past and in the 20th century. And I think that's something that, among those who do a lot of research in this area, it's generally acknowledged. If you look at most investment companies like BlackRock or JP Morgan, if you look at what their expectations of 10-year returns on risky assets are, they're quite a bit lower than the historical average. And thinking about what some of those implications are, I just have been talking about being more, being more liberal, spending more in retirement. And now I'm taking a step back and saying, all right, when we think about risk, are we overestimating the amount of benefit that we could get from taking a significant amount of risk and not even thinking enough about the downside? The other thing that I find from my own research is that very often people who are retirement age are more sensitive to ups and downs in the market, which means that when the market is going up, very often they want to take more risk. And when the market is going down, they very often want to take less risk. And that actually results in underperformance. I call it the inverse law of demand. When people go to the grocery store and milk is twice as expensive, they want to buy less of it. But when they invest and stocks are twice as expensive as they've been historically, they want to buy more of it because the price has been going up. And the inverse is true. When stocks are cheap, people tend to want to buy less of it. So how do we incorporate some of these expectations about investment returns and also build in some of these behavioral responses when we're putting together a strategy?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And then in your mind, just curious, do you see a role for technology in supporting retirees, whether it's lifestyle or financial lives?
Absolutely. I think that to the extent that we can delegate to technology, I don't understand why technology hasn't advanced farther to be able to prescribe spending to us, in addition to recommending stuff that we should buy that we'll likely enjoy, also looking at our current financial situation and making a prescription about how much we can probably safely spend next month. That kind of guidance, I think, could be incredibly valuable. And I'm actually working on some technology that might allow you to do that.
Interesting. Okay, so we'll keep our ears and eyes open. All right. So for yourself, what are some current projects? Maybe that's one, but some current projects or upcoming research that you're working on, and how can our listeners follow along or keep in touch?
If you want to follow along to my research, you can either follow me on LinkedIn, Michael Finke. You can follow me on Social Science Research Network. So I have my own author page on ssrn.com. I also write for ThinkAdvisor and ThinkAdvisor magazine and Advisor Perspectives magazine. So you can look at my past writings by looking me up for each of those publications. And I'm doing a lot of surveys right now on some of these relationships between health behaviors and financial behaviors. And it's really fascinating. One of the most important aspects seems to be optimism and having a positive outset about the future. And people who have a positive outset or positive mindset about the future, they tend to be far more likely to save money for retirement. They tend to be more active. And, one of the things that seems to be very valuable is just simply imagining what your life is going to be like, building up what we like to call imagination capital as a way of motivating yourself to make some of these better choices about saving and health. It's to me, the research is really compelling.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. And so just so everybody knows, our listeners, we'll get all that contact info and everything in the show notes. So retirementplanningsimplified.ca, you'll be able to find the episode there. And so, Michael, any key takeaways or action items that you want to leave our listeners with before we sign off?
Oh, Joe, just be deliberate give a little bit of thought to how you want to live and pay a little bit of attention to people who are in retirement. Figure out what the ones that are happiest are doing right.
Awesome. That's great. I appreciate you joining us today, Michael.
My pleasure.